Welcome to City and State TV. I'm Executive Editor Michael Johnson. I'm joined now by Ritchie Torres, council member representing Central Bronx, and he's also the chair of the Public Housing Committee. Thanks for joining me.
I'm honored to be here.
Thanks. So obviously with public housing, the biggest issue is NYCHA. NYCHA is the provider of 400,000 plus units of public housing in New York City and has a terrible perception problem that's probably happened and been cultivated over years of just bad headlines. How do you combat that credibility problem with NYCHA and therefore be able to turn that corner and maybe convince people to do more investment into NYCHA and to improve the clearly decrepit conditions that a lot of these facilities have?
Well, there's no question that we have to change the image of public housing because NYCHA does have an image problem, but we have to ask what is at the root of NYCHA's problems. So part of it is mismanagement of resources, but the heart of it, the lion's share of it, is disinvestment at every level of government. So if you under-resource any institution, whether it be the MTA or HHC or the New York City Housing Authority, it's going to perform more poorly. The political establishment deserves most of the responsibility for NYCHA's failure.
And I think it's all clear, it's clear to pretty much everyone that this has mostly been a federal funding issue. NYCHA's strength through the years as it grew into this establishment that was a gem in the nation as far as public housing, then the funding dropped off at the federal level, and that's where there's been the gaps.
So, NYCHA's been in existence for 80 years. We pioneered public housing development on a mass scale here in New York City. I think the Housing Authority was founded in 1934. And for most of its history, NYCHA was widely regarded as a high-performing public housing authority. It's only in the last 15 to 20 years that it became an institution struggling to survive. And that is largely a function not only of federal disinvestment, but there was a complete withdrawal of state operating funds in 1998, a complete withdrawal of city operating funds in 2003, not to mention all the dollars that the city extracts from the Housing Authority in the form of payments. The Housing Authority pays $300 million worth of payments every year to the city. So that's $300 million not spent on replacing bricks, elevators, boilers, millions of dollars that could go towards security improvements like intercoms and cameras. So there's been disinvestment at every level that has done irreparable damage to the lives of public housing residents and to our public housing stock.
I think it's clear at this point that on the federal level, you can't really depend on funding for the near future at least. So how on the state and city level do you convince people that investing back in NYCHA is important, and especially when you get these headlines over and over again that of neglect or abuse or just of mismanagement of funds?
Well, the neglect is a function of disinvestment. If you have a runner, if I think of NYCHA as a runner, and the city or state have tied the runner's hands behind its back, has cut its legs off, are you going to expect that runner to win the marathon? So, we've put NYCHA in a situation where it's no longer preserving public housing. It's managing the decline of public housing. And the argument for reinvestment is quite simple. NYCHA is too big to fail. It houses a population the size of Boston. It is the largest provider of affordable housing in our city. Manages 178,000 units of public housing, administers 88,000 Section 8 vouchers. It provides affordable housing that is affordable to the poorest residents in our city. And so without public housing, we would have hundreds of thousands of people overflowing our homeless shelters. It is the core of affordability in New York City.
And with NYCHA housing, roughly 90%, if not more, is Black and Latino communities.
Overwhelmingly, yeah.
Do you think there's a race issue here? Do you think that there is, this stigma sense that, you have people in communities that maybe are predominantly white, or then they don't want to invest in NYCHA and they look at NYCHA as a negative investment, and there's a racial element to that?
I do believe there's a racial element, right? The common refrain that we saw in 2014 is Black Lives Matter. And, nowhere is Black and brown life more devalued than in public housing. We've seen catastrophic disinvestment from public housing as if we have forgotten that there are people who live in these buildings. And the 400,000 residents who live in public housing are entitled to safe, decent, and affordable housing. That's a moral imperative, and we've completely neglected their interests. So I do believe it's unconscionable, and there is a racial subtext here.
And now as we look going forward, we see that they're starting to make some of these public-private partnerships to fix up some of the NYCHA projects. How do you view, well, first of all, for our viewers, explain a little bit of what the details of that, and how do you view this going forward? Do you think it's going to be a good thing? Do you think it's going to help turn around NYCHA going forward, or is it just kind of like, paint over the walls or paint over the cracks a little bit?
Well, there are a few mixed financing strategies specific to different circumstances. So you had federalization a few years ago. You recently had the tri-borough agreement. And then there's a program known as the Rental Assistance Demonstration Program that would convert public housing into project-based Section 8 so that NYCHA could access public as well as private sources of financing, so bond financing, tax credits, the same tools that are available to private affordable housing developers. So it's a means of recapitalizing the public housing stock, bringing in more dollars for capital improvements while preserving the same levels of affordability, 30% of gross adjusted income.
But to that level, do you think that this is a solution that's viable going forward, or do you think that...
Well, politically complicated.
Yeah.
But what's the alternative? The alternative is demolition by neglect, right? If, waiting for federal funds that will never come is not an option. Demolition by neglect is not an option. And so NYCHA has to find new creative streams of funding because we cannot afford to let these buildings deteriorate. We have a moral obligation to every one of those tenants to ensure that their homes remain livable. And there's no such thing as an affordable New York City without the New York City Housing Authority. Most of the affordable housing units that we're going to create under the mayor's housing plan is at 60% of AMI, 60% of, or 50% is about, $40,000 a year, which is double the median income in my district.
Yep.
So, the vast majority of units that we're creating under the mayor's housing plan are unaffordable to the poorest residents in our city. And the only affordable housing options for those residents are public housing, which is managed by NYCHA, and Section 8 vouchers, which are largely administered by NYCHA. So NYCHA is indispensable to the affordability of our city.
And I guess the point I was getting to is, do you think that this public-private partnership is the only route to go, or do you think that there is a way to convince the state and the city to invest directly in?
So it's an $18 billion budget gap, right?
Yeah.
So the city and the state, in and of itself, does not have the capacity to close that gap. But I think you're hitting on a key point, that there is no single magic bullet that's going to solve NYCHA's problems, right? You need a whole range of tools to manage the challenges that the housing authority is facing. So one is what I would call a city and state reinvestment, a partnership. You have the model I would think of as New York, right? The city and state have an agreement around funding supportive housing development throughout the state. Why not have a comparable agreement around investing in public housing? So a long-term partnership, a contract between the city and state that sustains investment in public housing over the long haul. That's one option. The second is you can have an infusion of investment from the bank settlements that can bring in, a one-time infusion of dollars into the housing authority. The rental assistance demonstration program could generate more capital dollars for the public housing stock. And then exempting NYCHA from all those payments. The only justifiable payment is the DEP payment, but everything else should be exempt. I mean, why is NYCHA paying pilot property taxes? Cultural institutions are exempt from property taxes, so should the housing authority. That's $30 million a year. That's $300 million over the course of 10 years that could go toward capital improvements.
And as you mentioned, there's the settlement money, which is being debated in Albany, how that's going to be spent in a lot of ways. Are you emboldened by the elevation of Carl Hastie to speaker? Do you think that is going to actually bring a voice for possibly spending some of that settlement money into improving NYCHA going forward? Or are you kind of more disenfranchised by the fact that Senate Republicans have essentially said that they want to spend this on larger infrastructure projects? Governor has kind of said he wants to spend it on larger infrastructure projects.
Well, NYCHA is a large infrastructure project, so... well, look, there are 4 people in the room, 2 of whom are from the Bronx. The Bronx, you have Carl Hastie from the Assembly, you have Jeff Klein from the State Senate. I recently worked with Jeff Klein to issue a report on the conditions of public housing, and I know he's fighting hard for more funding at the state level. As far as Carl, he's going to reflect the priorities of his conference. Knowing Carl as chairman of the Bronx Democratic Party, and I know the Assembly is deeply committed to preserving public housing. So.
As far as like a priority, do you think it's high enough on their priority list going forward? I mean, as far as the Assembly's conference, but also just in general. I feel it seems to me as I follow Albany that there's this there's a it's just not sexy to fix NYCHA housing, whereas it's sexier for them to argue that they should build new bridges, new roads, new highways.
If NYCHA buildings have to be evacuated in 10 or 20 years, that's not terribly sexy either. So, I don't think, I have to imagine that Assembly and the State Senate are ultimately not concerned with what is sexy, but actually doing the right thing. And the stakes are high. NYCHA is in a state of catastrophic decline, and we don't really have time to play games about what's sexy. I think we should do right by the Housing Authority. This is a crucial moment, because if we fail to do right by the Housing Authority, I think the consequences are going to come back to haunt us in 10 or 20 years.
And as we talk about Albany and what they're negotiating right now, part of the rent regulation fight is the 421A tax rebate. And I know you've suggested that NYCHA should be available to get some of these tax rebates as well.
So one frustration I have is that NYCHA is both the greatest, there's affordable housing and then there's deeply affordable housing. And NYCHA is the greatest source of deeply affordable housing affordable to the poorest residents in our city. And, for me, the public political establishment and our policymakers seem to have a bias against public housing, because we talk about and think about affordable housing to the exclusion of NYCHA. And I'm wondering to myself, why is the Housing Authority not part of the conversation about reform of the 421A tax abatement? Why could the city and the state not leverage the power we have over tax abatements to incentivize more private investment in public housing, for boilers, for bricks, for physical infrastructure improvements? If we could use 421A tax abatement to the benefit of private affordable housing, then why not use it to the benefit of public housing, which is our most indispensable source of deeply affordable housing? So NYCHA should be part of that conversation. And my objective is to overcome that public policy bias against NYCHA. And
Mayor de Blasio has also proposed using NYCHA to house a lot of, or a small number of homeless people, homeless families moving forward. Is that something you think that is a smart idea and also a viable idea going forward?
Look, I think NYCHA is a powerful tool for driving down the rate of homelessness. So if we could set aside more units for homeless families, more units for domestic violence survivors, I'm all for it. So.
Great. And before I let you go, I just want to ask you if there's anything else you've been working on, anything else we should look for going forward in the City Council, any bills you want to highlight?
I did introduce a bill that regulates industrial laundries. So the city presently regulates retail laundries, but it fails to regulate industrial laundries, which service hotels, hospitals, and restaurants. So you have millions of Americans who are seeking care in our hospitals, eating at our restaurants, going to our hotels, coming into contact with linens and fabrics that have been processed by industrial laundries that have no health or safety protocols at all. And the case study that comes to mind is one in New Orleans. You had 5 children who died in New Orleans after coming into contact with linens in a hospital that had fungus, and those linens were processed by an industrial laundry. So we have a vested interest, a public health interest, in ensuring that there are health and safety protocols in our industrial laundries.
Do you have any sense of how big of a scale this problem is in New York City? Clearly, there's thousands of houses or hotels and restaurants, and there's obviously a lot of industrial laundry being happening. But do you feel that there's, Well,
part of it is we don't know, right?
Yeah.
We know that millions of people in New York City and beyond come into contact with these fabrics, but there's no telling the number of industrial laundries that exist. It's an underground industry, and so the goal is to bring greater transparency and greater standards to that industry. Not to mention the ruthless exploitation of low-wage workers, many of whom are largely immigrants from boroughs like the Bronx, Brooklyn, and Queens.
So right now, the city doesn't have any
regulatory.
System to regulate it whatsoever.
We have a regulatory regime for retail laundries, so I'm looking to expand it to include industrial laundries. Give DCA the authority to license and regulate industrial laundries.
Is there a sense of how much more that would cost in the budget to do that, or is that something where you just change their directive and give?
I think it's going to be much more cost effective than usual, because you're simply building on an existing regulatory scheme.
Great. Councilman Ritchie Torres, thank you very much for joining us.
Of course, it's an honor.